thank you for giving me the opportunity today to talk to you about stress and coping. This is something I've spent my entire professional life working on. I started out as a psychology major at the University of California in Santa Barbara and fell in love with the brain and how it influences our behavior. So I went on to get a master's degree in a physiological psychology lab looking at stress and hormones and immune function in rats. From there, I went on to work in an immunology lab and then to get my PhD in clinical psychology, again looking at stress, this time in the caregivers of patients with Alzheimer's disease. Since moving to San Antonio to take a job at UTSA, I have been studying the impact of the stress of modern life on individuals, on the way we cope, and on our mental health. Those stresses include everything from the pace of modern life, to the impact of the media, to the pressures that students experience now trying to complete their college studies while facing all of the logistic and financial challenges that are part of going to college. Along with my academic career, I've also always worked as a clinician in California. I spent a year at the VA, and here in Texas, I have had a small private practice that I see clients a couple of evenings a week in addition to being at the university. I was joking with a colleague not long ago that this background somehow made me uniquely qualified to talk about the situation that is going on with the coronavirus pandemic, even though it caught us all literally off guard. As a sort of an adjunct story, I actually flew to Italy in January of this year with 64 students and several other faculty members for a study abroad program. Needless to say, we flew home in a somewhat chaotic condition on March 2nd, spent 14 days in self-isolation, actually checking our temperature and talking to a doctor every day. And fortunately, did not have any of the members of our group get sick, but we got out of isolation about 4 days before Texas started to shut down again. So the whole issue of coping with the stressors of modern life, the things we had going on, and then superimposing the very real stress of dealing with this virus. In addition, the effects of the lockdown, which have changed our lives, our activities, our finances, and then adding in the social unrest, the protests, the issues that have come up in part because the virus has really highlighted the inequities in our social system, but also because some of these problems have been simmering beneath the surface and for quite some time. So when I was asked to talk to you about peace and patience, it seemed like a really good opportunity for me to rethink how I present my view of stress and how I think about coping in a way that was specific to this period of time. I thought it'd be interesting, so I went ahead and looked up the definition of peace in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it actually is a multifaceted term. Peace involves freedom from disquieting thoughts or emotions, or a state of tranquility or quiet. It can also be used to describe harmony in personal relationships and the absence of war, violence, and civil discord in a society. I have a feeling that all four of those things are issues we are struggling with right now. We have been watching a variety of different social movements unwind online. Even if we're not going to the protests, most of us are seeing them on TV, the conflicts over wearing masks. It is very hard not to be stressed and anxious in a time when there's a lot of change going on. And Harmony, among others, is sometimes strained when we're all living in the same house, unable to go to school and work and do the things that we might normally think of as ways to sort of get time or space from each other. So I'm going to be touching on all of those aspects of peace, but I also looked up patience, the capacity to accept or tolerate a delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. That is a tall order, and it has something to do with the way the brain works and the fact that emotions, especially if they're related to survival, are very strong. But one of the reasons that psychology has been so effective at helping people cope in the last 50 or 60 years is that we have very much realized that the links between thoughts and feelings are very powerful and sometimes not in our conscious awareness. So I will be talking later today about ways to understand those links so that we can be more patient with ourselves, with the people around us, with our political system, and all the things that are going on just now. Now, in my background of studying stress and coping, of course I've looked at everyday modern hassles, life events, the things that we deal with. I've also spent a fair amount of time talking about extraordinary stress, disasters, situations that happen that are outside the norm and cause a major disruption to a community or a group of people. I have studied how the media covers disasters, how people think about them, and I'm also a volunteer with a group called the Green Cross Academy of Traumatology, GCAT for short, which provides disaster mental health professionals in settings in communities that have had a disaster. So traveling with GCAT, I have gone to Rockport, Texas after Hurricane Harvey. I have gone to Puerto Rico twice in the wake of Maria. I have been to the fires out in Paradise, California. And in doing that work, I became familiar with something that disaster responders talk about, which is the expected curve, the normal way that we deal with major disruptive stresses. So think a minute about the last flood or fire or tornado or hurricane that you paid attention to. And of course, in some cases, there is time for pre-disaster warnings, people telling you, board up your house and move inland. Sometimes there's not. But with natural disasters and even with man-made violence, there's typically a point of impact, a time at which things are difficult, people are stressed, but it's relatively acute, maybe hours, maybe a couple of days. But the storm moves on, the earthquake ends, the fire burns out, and there is a set of responses that we have based on that timeline. During the immediate impact and a little bit after, we often see lots of heroic kinds of responses. People are out in the streets saving each other, trying to find their neighbors. First responders are courageous, and we share those stories and feel good that we are working together. We then move into a honeymoon stage where there's a lot of evidence that people really are good and really can cooperate to find solutions. So during the honeymoon phase, you'll see volunteers coming from other states. You will see people talking about efforts to collect supplies, to provide services. And even the survivors of the disaster during those phases are acutely aware, not just of what they lost, but of what they could have lost. So you will see people saying, well, we lost the house, but at least all of us are safe. Those sorts of comments. Unfortunately, the heroic and the honeymoon stages often then devolve into what we call the disillusionment stage. This is the stage when the cameras leave, the people who don't live at the disaster move on, and you still have a yard full of debris, you don't have a job, it looks like building your community back is going to be hard, people disagree on how to do it. The disillusionment stage can last for months or even years. And then eventually, There is a period where we can say, look, we've recovered, we've reconstructed, we can talk about what we did better, what we need to do next time. So I wanted to apply this to thinking about a pandemic, and you can immediately see that there are some issues. First of all, this pandemic does not have an acute start and stop. It is a rolling problem. It's crossed the world, it's crossed the US, and it ebbs and flows. So even states that thought they were getting a handle on it are finding that they're not getting a handle on it. So there is no clear end in sight, and that sort of uncertainty makes humans really, really uncomfortable. We have been sharing our heroic and honeymoon stories about healthcare workers sacrificing their lives, neighbors singing on their balconies, but we've also been experiencing what some people are calling pandemic fatigue, just being tired of the anxiety, the uncertainty, and our inability even to plan for the future because we're not sure when we're going to have a handle on this situation, both in terms of public health and also in terms of scientific breakthroughs like treatments and vaccines. As we enter this disillusionment phase, there are a lot of symptoms you're probably feeling. One of the things I hear people say a lot is that they're just exhausted. It takes so much more energy to shop when things are hard to find, when you have to go at special hours, when you have to find your mask, when you're worried about contamination on everything that you touch. It is harder to stay in touch with families when you can't just drop by or go out to a movie or have people over, and instead are having to make phone calls, figure out technology like Zoom, and also make hard decisions about who to see. Do you really need to isolate from your grandparents because you don't want to expose them to viruses? Or is that isolation going to lead to loneliness and stress or mental health issues that are as distressing as perhaps the virus would be? Do you let your kids or your teens socialize with a small group of people? How do you make those decisions? In addition, we're juggling a lot. If you're working from home and homeschooling kids, you're really trying to do two jobs at the same time. If you're working in an industry where you're still going out to work, childcare may be a concern as well as exposure to the virus yourself. And in a lot of workplaces that normally are fairly routine, COVID has changed everything. Grocery store workers who are used to answering questions about food are suddenly having to deal with challenges about masks and things they didn't necessarily sign up to have to deal with. A lot of us also feel disoriented, time-wise, space-wise. It's odd to look out your window and your yard looks exactly the way it always has, but the rest of the world feels so different. And we're losing the external markers that would give us a sense of what day it is, what week it is. Going to work sets up a difference between your days off and the days at work. School creates a structure so kids go to bed at a certain time and get up at a different time. Even the things that we would link normally to the passing months. It was kind of strange when we didn't have tax day. In many, many cities and communities, we've lost our fiestas, carnivals, rodeos, things we usually look forward to. Now we're going into summer, and weddings, vacations, 4th of July celebrations are all going to look very different. And as we go through this, I suspect many of you have had that feeling of waking up and thinking, I honestly, truly do not know what day it is. Or of letting your sleep get drifted so that you're staying up later and later and getting up earlier, or the reverse, and really not feeling like the anchors that you would normally have at the beginning and the end of the day are in play. Of course, we also are dealing with all sorts of emotional responses, worry about the virus, about people who may be ill, major worry and concern about the economy, the financial impact it's going to have on us individually, whether we're going to end up in a recession again, and the social unrest that has emerged after the killing of George Floyd, which has made many, many people feel overwhelmed beyond just the pandemic, but in looking at all of the many inequities we have in our society, and the fact that police brutality might have been the start of the conversation, but one thing this pandemic has highlighted is that people who live in poverty don't necessarily have access to even the means to continue their kids' education when the school's closed, or to get the lunches that their children need. The healthcare disparities in our country are showing up in who's getting and who's dying of COVID. So there's a lot of fear and a lot of sadness, and also a lot of confusion. Humans like predictability. Research shows that if I tell you, look, I'm going to put an electrode on your finger and give you a shock, and if it's a random shock, it'll actually be less painful than if I give you a warning and give you a beep or a light before the shock. Not surprisingly, people usually pick the stronger shock with the warning than the weaker shock without that warning. So right now, we have suddenly entered a world that most of us had only vaguely ever thought about. What's an antibody? What's a vaccine? What does herd immunity mean? What is flattening the curve? Who ever heard of social distancing? Which actually, incidentally, should have been called physical distancing, not social distancing. When did we all become experts on N95 masks and, welding shields and all the other things we're trying to use to keep safe? And what we might normally do is look to the experts. What do the public health folks, the scientists, the doctors say? Well, many of them are in disagreement. And of course, our politicians are also disagreeing. And there are legitimate concerns on the table about balancing risks. How willing are we to hurt the economy to protect people from the spread of the virus? And at what point does harming the economy cause health problems that are as serious for people as the virus? We don't know. Magnifying the whole thing is the fact that we live in a media environment that people have never had to deal with before. In the past, getting information was the problem. People had a great deal of trouble even finding out basic events. There have been times in the history of the country when battles went on in wars that had ended because the message had not reached the people at the outskirts of the event. They didn't know it had happened. Of course, today, with 24-hour news, the internet, there is a constant flow of information, and there are some factors that really matter. The news in today's capitalistic kind of environment has to earn its own way. It has to compete with entertainment. It has to draw advertisers, and advertisers respond to viewers. So the folks in communication have really looked at the changes in how the news is presented to us over the last several decades, maybe since TV started. It has become more sensational. It has become more catastrophic, more gripping. If you just watch the television news, you might think that all of us die from violence and homicide and fiery car wrecks, when really more routine things like cardiovascular disease are higher risks for most people. And there is also a tendency in the news to focus on problems, to highlight issues that catch our attention, but not to circle back and give us information on solutions or clarifications or what has worked in other places. And a little bit later, I'll talk about managing some of that news flow, because I do think that is a part of gaining the peace and patience that we're talking about. But from a cognitive point of view, if you are trying to decide what type of mask to wear, you can go on Amazon and literally find hundreds of masks. And you can do a search online and find multiple websites arguing for or against different combinations. And we know that people don't do well with lots of choices. If we only have a choice between A and B, we're pretty good at picking one and saying, well, I didn't have much choice, so I'll make do. If we have a choice between lots of things, we tend to dither, to worry, and then later to second guess and do a lot of if-only thinking. So the uncertainty around how to stay safe and what to do in the face of this virus is contributing to the emotional distress that many of us are feeling. Other people might even have been talking to you about feeling distracted or disengaged. I'm used to talking in class, sometimes 6, 8, 10 hours a week. I might lecture. I talk to people one-on-one as clients in my practice. And suddenly I'm doing asynchronous lectures. I'm talking on Zoom meetings. I'm talking to clients on the phone. And I found it takes a whole different set of, not even a whole different set, a whole different mindset to stay focused in these different conditions. How can I pay attention to what's going on the Zoom screen and not get distracted in looking at my email or something else? How do I pace my talks when I can't see people nodding or frowning or giving me nonverbal cues about how it's going? How do I read the facial expressions of people if I can barely see their head because it's getting all fuzzed out into the, Zoom screen that they've put up of a hobbit town or something else? It takes a lot of cognitive effort to pay attention to these screen kinds of communications. It's harder for our brain. Our eyes get tired. We're processing things differently, and we don't have the feedback. We can't necessarily get all the nonverbal signals, and most of us find it kind of disconcerting to continue to see ourselves talking and interacting. Normally in a conversation, you don't see yourself up in the little corner and start worrying about your hair or something else while you're trying to communicate with other people. So that distraction or disengagement is affecting everybody, from second graders trying to do their classes online to college students to people in the work environment. The last strong emotion I'm going to mention is grief. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, I don't know anyone who has COVID or who has been directly affected by the violence in some of these cities, so I probably don't really have a right to feel grief or loss or sadness. But our brain doesn't work that way. Certainly if you have lost someone you care about to COVID or any other kind of experience in the last few months, you will feel grief. But we also feel grief about the things we've had to give up, the things that we've lost. Not having the connections, the events, the graduations, the vacations that would actually normally be part of our social structure and that we would use to build connections, to enjoy time with family or connect with people. So there is quite a bit of grief going on, and if you've lost a job, lost other tangible things, you may be also grieving the loss of that role, that connections, those finances. Now, up till now, I think I might have just made you all think about the things that are causing you to be stressed, and I hope what I have not done is given you the sense that there is no way to combat or deal with these things. Now, what I think we have to talk about is acknowledging how we feel is the first step, but understanding how we can move forward and what we can do differently is the second step. So I've got a 3-point plan I want to talk about today. When I lecture in class, I have PowerPoints, and I've gotten very dependent on my bullet points as a way to show people how things work. And incidentally, I do have a bit of a PowerPoint put together to keep me on track here, which I am more than happy to share if people want that in the future. But anyway, here are the correlates of my 3-point plan. The first one is that we have to gain a better understanding of our thoughts and feelings and how to manage them. And I'm not talking about this in an abstract way. I'm talking about specific ways to understand what is going on for each of us as individuals as we deal with the current situation. So 1, we will talk about thoughts and feelings. 2, we have to take control of our communication patterns. How are we interacting with others? How are we allowing their interactions to influence us? And that includes the role of the media, both in affecting how we think, and also because right now, with the ability to share media and share information online, a lot of social interactions, Facebook interactions, family conflicts are stemming from disagreements about the media. So I'll touch on that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about something that seems more esoteric, but I think we need to remind ourselves constantly about the need to treat ourselves and the people around us with compassion and care. This is not an easy situation. It's an unprecedented situation. The last time we had a pandemic of this magnitude was back during with the Spanish flu. We didn't have TV, we didn't have computers, we didn't have internet, we didn't have families that were mostly dual career. There are so many things that make it different and have changed what we need to do and how we need to do it to cope. So let's start in on the 3-point plan. As a young psychologist, I was exposed to a lot of the research of Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis. These are the two individuals who are credited with coming up with cognitive behavioral therapy. Beck was an MD, Ellis was a psychologist. They had both noticed that when they worked with people who were depressed, and they later extended this to all kinds of emotions like anxiety and anger, what they found out is that those people tended to have characteristic sets of thoughts, ways that they framed the world, attributions that they made about what had happened, and that those thoughts weren't necessarily conscious, but that they linked or elicited specific emotions very quickly, and people weren't tracking sort of this automatic downward spiral that they would get into. Beck called them dysfunctional beliefs. Ellis called them irrational beliefs. And if you were to Google right now, you could find hundreds of websites that gave you examples of different thought feeling patterns that fit in to this conceptualization. Just to make it easy as kind of an overview, I have grouped them into 3 categories. Although this is a quick overview, there's a lot of nuances and there is more to understand about how we develop these patterns. But as you're thinking about your own stress and responses to COVID over the last 3 months, first category of dysfunctional, irrational thoughts I'd like you to think about is how much you've been focusing on social approval. What will the people around you think of your decision to go to work or to stay home and isolate, to wear masks or not to wear masks? How much are you scanning Facebook or social media to see if people might be perhaps criticizing you or ideas that you adhere to as part of the situation? How much have you been worried about competence, how good you are, whether you can really work from home and maintain your standards at work? What will your child's teacher or the parents of your child's classmates think if your kid's not getting the right answers on what is now a Zoom lesson instead of an in-class experience? How much are you worried about taking care of the people around you? If you've had a lot of thoughts about approval, personalization, and your own competence, then what Beck and Ellis would argue is that you have probably also been dealing with feelings of sadness, perhaps guilt, maybe a sense of helplessness or regret. It doesn't have to go all the way to depression, although these thoughts are associated with depression. And so I kind of think of this first category of socially oriented thoughts as the sad grouping. Now, some of you are saying, I'm not depressed. I'm anxious. I'm worried. And that would bring me to my second category, which I think of as the bad grouping. If you're a person who tends to catastrophize or magnify a lot, then you may well be struggling with anxiety. I come from a family of great catastrophizers. If someone is supposed to call us at 8 o'clock and they haven't called us by 9 o'clock, we can have them crashed in a ditch somewhere. Catastrophizers are people who look at something that's happened and immediately imagine all the way out to the worst case scenario. Magnifiers take small things and ruminate on them until they become much bigger. In a college student setting, I would describe this as the kid who gets a C on the first test in my class. And they come in my office crying. And they tell me that that C means that they're not going to get an A in my class. If they don't get an A in my class, then they're probably not going to get into graduate school. If they don't get into graduate school, then they're going to let down their entire family and be a failure. And then we back up and I say, let's just go back to the C. How did you study? Well, I didn't really study. I couldn't afford the book, or I was up all night working on something else, or I got called to a second shift at work. So does that mean that you can't master the material in my class, or that we need to talk about skills and strategies so you can do better on the next test and not go all the way out to the end of that catastrophic ladder that you've built for yourself? It is hard to not catastrophize and magnify, especially if you're a person who likes to prevent problems and feels like it's important to anticipate and avoid things if you can. But in an uncertain time when we don't know how things are going to play out and we don't even always know what the best choices are, going along with those dysfunctional thoughts can actually make it harder to make decisions because anxiety doesn't allow us to think things through clearly. Few of you are saying I'm not sad and I'm not anxious, I'm just mad. And that is my third category. People who are involved, interested in justice, might be finding that they're really struggling with thoughts around blame, fairness, what should be done, what should be right, why wasn't the government more ready, why wasn't my place of employment better prepared for this, why don't my parents have good health insurance, how can I cope with my siblings who aren't helping with our elderly parents, a lot of political thoughts about what we should have done or could have done. One of the ways you can tell that you're sort of getting into these loops is if you're spending a lot of time with phrases that start with if. If only someone had done something, we wouldn't be here. Now, of course, I have not had time to study these three categories of thoughts specifically in regard to the COVID situation, although my lab is working on that. But following 9/11, we found that people's thoughts in the week after that crisis reliably fell into these three sorts of patterns, which suggests that you probably have sort of a go-to group. That doesn't mean that if I'm anxious, I can't be sad or mad as well. But what Beck and Ellis really urged people to do was to recognize that the thoughts that they were repeating, even if it wasn't very conscious, were driving both the kinds of emotions they had and also the magnitude of those emotions, how strongly they were feeling things. Now, I want to talk about feelings for just a minute, and then I'm going to give you a strategy for what to do if you identify some of these thought-feeling links. We live in a culture where feelings are treated in kind of strange and contradictory ways. First of all, they're wired in our brain. They're based to survival. So if you're very scared, very anxious, and your fight or flight response kicks on, it's going to swamp rational thought. And it's not going to be particularly verbal. In fact, if I asked you to describe a feeling for me, my students anyway can't do it. How do you feel when you're angry? Well, I feel agitated. My face turns red. My hands sweat. What they're telling me is physiological sensations that are associated with the feeling, but they can't give me a description of the feeling that doesn't tie into those kinds of nonverbal clues. The other thing about feelings is they're not random. We don't always like them. We may not want them. We often try to ignore them, which isn't a particularly good strategy. And what I have come to describe with my clients is that emotions are very much like pain. And actually, recently there's been some literature showing that there may be parts of the brain that process both pain and emotions, so showing that there is really a strong link. What is pain? It's a signal that something is wrong. It tells you there's something you need to deal with, and that if you ignore it, the situation may get worse. Well, what are emotions? They are signals that something is bothering you, is inconsistent. Basically, something is wrong. But we don't treat them the same way. You would never go into your doctor's office and go, I don't know why my ankle hurts and it shouldn't. You go in and you say, I don't know why my ankle hurts and I want to figure out why. But people come into my clinical office all the time. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but my husband's a great provider, but my wife takes good care of the kids, but. And what I say is, I don't know if the feeling's right or wrong. Feelings can be wrong. They can be based on misinterpretations, exaggerations, all those kind of cognitive thoughts that I was discussing. But they are a warning. If you know that your husband takes good care of the finances, but feel like he's not really connecting with you intimately, that is a sign of a problem. It might not be an accurate feeling, and you might need to really work in therapy to figure out what's going on, how the two of you are or are not communicating, etc. But I guarantee you that ignoring those sorts of feelings doesn't make them go away. And eventually what they do is leak out in anger, sadness, or other kinds of responses. So my argument about feelings is not that we should assume they're always right, and not that we should just give in to them and say, well, I can't help how I feel, but that we should use feelings as a clue that there's something we need to look more deeply at, so we can think about the links between those feelings, the situation, the causes, and how we want to move forward. And that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is really about. If you're finding this intriguing, I will give you the name of a book that has some really useful ways to track it down, but you could just take these notes down right now and try this yourself. For the next week, every time you feel yourself getting a little bit emotionally distressed, jot down on your phone, on a piece of paper, even in your head, what was the triggering event? I was trying to get to the grocery store and someone cut me off in the parking lot and took the spot I wanted. And my thoughts immediately went to, this is not fair, that's not right, I want to ram them. And you got angry. Or your thoughts went to, I can't even find a parking spot, I can't do anything right, it's all hopeless. And you got sad. Or you thought, the grocery store is going to be crowded, all of these idiots in the parking lot are going to be in there and I'm going to get COVID. And it's going to, ruin my life. And you got anxious. But what you do is you do that for a week. Every situation. What was the actual event that triggered it? You saw a picture on Facebook. Someone at work said something. You dropped your keys and couldn't find your phone. Whatever that was. And then identify the thoughts and the feelings that go with it. It'll be a mixed bag. Nobody's going to be in one category only. But I suspect that most of you will find that you have a bit of a pattern that you go to. And that pattern is based on certain automatic assumptions or attributions that you're not even questioning. Once you've kept that log for a little bit, the next step is to question your assumptions. So next time someone cuts you off in the parking lot and you think, everyone's incivil, the world has gone crazy, we're never going to get through these problems, and, it's never been this difficult to be alive. You might think to yourself, maybe that person's even more distracted than I am. Maybe they have, a sick kid at home, they weren't paying attention when they pulled in. Maybe we're not more rude than we ever were, but in the modern world, we have way more opportunities to see people, to connect. My grandparents lived in a town of a couple thousand people. You almost knew everybody there. I probably see more people in one trip to HEB than they saw in an entire week moving around their little town. And most of the people I see are not people I even know. They're strangers, and I don't know how they're going to respond to me. I don't know why they're stressed. I don't know what's going on in their lives. So it's easy to assume that everyone is hostile and incivil when maybe it's just a difference that relates to our world. If you want to kind of think about that again, imagine the last time you were driving and someone swerved into your lane and cut you off, and as you were getting all worked up to be mad, they gave you that funny little wave, the shrug, the face that says, oh, I'm so sorry, I messed up, it's my fault. And you pivoted and thought, okay, they're lost or whatever. When we can understand people's feelings underneath, we don't always make the same attributions, have the same beliefs about what they're doing. So what you do at this step is you start assessing the validity of your thoughts. Are you really going to get COVID because people in the parking lot are rude? Is this really going to go on forever? Are we going to find a vaccine eventually? What are alternative thoughts? Maybe the person that didn't say hi to you in the aisle wasn't indicating that they hate you or disagree with your stance on masks, but they were so stressed about something else they didn't even notice that you were there. The point of cognitive behavioral therapy is that feelings are rapid, they're hardwired, they're not verbal. But thoughts are the cognitive overlay that we have, and they can be conscious, and we can control them, and we can actively change those thoughts if we become aware of those patterns. When I very first started teaching, I would drop into a large classroom, 100 students, and I would think to myself, how am I going to please all of these people? How am I going to make this lecture reach out to a classroom of people who range in age from 18 to, a returning veteran who's seen all kinds of stress? And it eventually dawned on me that the thought that was wrong is that I had to please everybody, because I can't, because it's not possible. I don't know everything going on in their lives. And when I started walking into classes saying, I'm going to give the most authentic lecture that I can, I'm going to be as open as I can to watching people's signals, to reading the room, to trying to notice when someone looks agitated or upset or bored, and to offering them opportunities to communicate, it changed my approach. It didn't mean I was really teaching very much differently or that my course evaluations got that different, but it gave me a way to manage my thoughts and feelings instead of setting up an impossible goal that would make me anxious teaching. Now I do a lot of speaking with younger teachers, and I share the idea that you can control your thoughts regardless of what's going on around you. Now that does come to something I mentioned just now, which is communication. How I speak to students. If you've ever gone to a lecture or a sermon or anywhere else where the person's nonverbals didn't match what they were talking about, the professor was telling you that something was important, but they looked like they were bored to tears as they droned on, or somebody was saying that a situation was fine, but they really looked so agitated that you didn't believe them, you realize that communication is a key part of managing any situation, never mind conflict. And it's also certainly part of maintaining peace between groups of people, between individuals, and even within ourselves. Communication is certainly the words we use, and that's where humans have an advantage. Part of what our brain does very well is learn and use language. We can use abstract concepts. We have different forms of language for different cultures, and it's allowed us in many ways to build on what we knew in the past, to communicate and to create huge societies. But there are still some very basic things that underlie communication. No matter what you are saying in your words, your body language and your tone of voice matter. If your teenager or spouse says to you, "No, I'm not mad, just leave me alone," you know darn well that they are mad. And our tendency is to trust the tone and the nonverbals, not the comments. Now, unfortunately, people who are very good at lying, con men, sometimes can control the nonverbals. That's how they take us in. And there are people who can control those nonverbals at will. Those are the folks that we consider to be great actors, great comedians, because most of us can't do that. But in normal conversation, we have to constantly be aware of the links between our nonverbal signals and what we're saying, and the links between the nonverbal signals and what the people we're talking to are saying. And we also have to really focus on listening, which is incredibly hard to do when you're emotionally engaged. Many of us spend much of our fighting time thinking about what we're going to say when that other person shuts up, which doesn't solve the problem, doesn't enable us to understand what their real concerns are, and is problematic if you're trying to actually understand and solve a problem. Part of this comes down to what we call intent and impact. Intent is what you meant to say, and impact is what the person heard. And you know how easily this can go awry. Someone walks in the room, their partner says, "Oh, is that a new sweater?" The person in the new sweater might think, "Gosh, they finally noticed. Maybe they think I look good." Or they might think, "Now they're going to complain I spent money." Unless you clarify with the person who spoke, you could make the wrong attribution and go off into a disagreement that wasn't even really based on something that was real. It's easy to think we can read other people's minds. The closer we are to people, the more we do it, which is one of the reasons that we can really get off the rails in communications with our family members. And it's harder to understand intent and impact when a conversation is through the media. You can't really see me moving around. I can't pace. I can't see you, so we're missing nonverbals. When we text and type, we can try to use emojis, but it's really hard to tell if someone's being sarcastic or mean or funny in a written statement. So a lot of times now we're already struggling. And then we've even superimposed masks on top. We cover up half of the nonverbal signals. And then we wonder why we all feel quite stressed and anxious and unable to really make decisions or tell what's going on around us. And it comes down to being much clearer in our communication. I read an article recently that talked about the fact that when you're wearing a mask, really means that you should be exaggerating your other nonverbal signals. People can see your eyes. Eye contact can be uncomfortable, but we can consciously look at people, and if you're smiling behind your mask, you can attempt to convey that with your eyes as well. We can use our hands, our arms, our bodies to indicate things that you might normally do with your mouth. And we need to think about how we communicate, what we say and how we do it. We really want to keep thinking that maybe something will change. They're going to have a vaccine and it's going to be ready by Halloween and we'll all be over this. And the reality is it might not happen. So given that reality, how are we going to go forward? Create a vision for taking care of ourselves, for solving problems, for taking care of each other, for thinking about what's really going on, not just behind people's masks, but behind their faces in general, what's really underlying their behavior, and then taking action to do that. Is this a guarantee that we'll always be patient and always do it perfectly? Of course not. There's going to be those tired days when hassles pile up and you just snap at someone. And that's when you might need to think to yourself, you know what, it's okay to let someone else take care of me, to let someone else step up, take over, and I'll get my equilibrium back if I do that. But it also means that we can let go of some of those if-only thoughts. None of us can change what happened in the lead up to COVID. We can change how we plan for the next pandemic, but being patient while we work through this and fostering our own internal sense of peace will also go a long way towards promoting peace among the people that we are living with. And ultimately, it's what we're going to have to do on a social level if we're going to find some ways to reconcile our differences and to move forward in a more equitable way that is not characterized by people sitting on their feelings until they explode into arguments, conflict, protests, and other things. So this may have been way more information than you wanted to hear. I may have touched on things that you'd like me to talk about more. And I know that in the question and answer sessions, we will have a time to do that. So I'm very much look forward to those sessions and seeing where we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Michael Jilton. I'm the rector of St. Philip's in Frisco. And as a priest, the question of peace, how do I find peace in a decision I have to make? How do I make sense of things in my life? How do I find peace in the midst of the chaos that's going on around me? This is the most frequent question that I've been asked in my ministry. So where do we find peace? I mean, it's not like I can say to you, gee, you need to be more peaceful, and then you go, wow, I never thought of that, right? Let's see what the Word of God has to say. This is from John chapter 14 and verse 27. Jesus says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. You heard me say to you, I am going away, and I will come to you. If you loved me, you would have rejoiced, because I am going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I." Now, throughout this section of John's Gospel, specifically in John 14, Jesus keeps turning the subject of the conversation to his death. In effect, what we're hearing in John 14 is Jesus' last will and testament. He says, after I die, you will inherit peace. Now think about what Jesus is saying there. Peace comes because the Son died and rose again. This is an objective and a factual statement. I, Jesus, die, you, my friends, receive peace. Not might get a little bit of peace, not can earn your peace, not finally have the ingredients to build up peace, but you have it now, it's yours today. So how does that work, you ask? Jesus, by giving his sinless life over to death in our place, paid the price for our sins, enduring completely and actually and objectively the consequences of our failures and our wrongs. Through the death of the Son, the Father has removed all reason for fear, no fear of death, no fear of punishment, no fear of chaos, all crucified with Christ. So that with this peace now, we can say to the world, circumstances can't rob me of the peace and the joy that I have in Christ, because Jesus' love for me is unconditional. We can say to shame, I don't need to hide, because Jesus became shame for me on the cross. We can say to sin and failure, you cannot condemn me, because Jesus took my punishment. Where can we find peace in the midst of today's chaos? Friends, that peace is in Christ. Because of who Jesus is and what he's done, we have peace. It's ours. He's given it to us.
Thank you for attending our speaker series, Supporting Families Through COVID-19, presented by Episcopal Family Ministry. Join us for a question and answer session via Zoom with the speaker this Thursday at 6 p.m., Friday at 8:30 p.m., or Saturday at 9:30 a.m. Please register for these calls with the link provided. The Episcopal Churches of Collin County are praying for you and your families.